Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring Kabbalah, science, and spirituality. With me is Dr. Vernon Neppe, who is a psychiatrist and a neuropsychiatrist. He is the director of the Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute in Seattle. He is also the author of a book called Reality Begins with Consciousness, which he wrote with physicist Dr. Edward Close. Welcome, Vernon.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Pleasure to be with you once again. Now, I should mention, I didn't earlier, you've authored over 700 scientific papers, and yet, given your scientific background, I think it's fascinating that you also have an interest in the Hebrew Kabbalah mystical tradition.
Yes, indeed. And it began in a very strange way. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was over a period of several years. I know that one component of it was when I was doing a fellowship in neuropsychiatry, behavioral neurology, psychopharmacology at Cornell University in New York. And I was contacted by letter this time by a certain individual, I'll call him PL, who, this was probably his 20th or 30th contact with me.
Oh.
And wrote and said, "Vernon, are you busy studying Kabbalah yet?" This was bizarre, because this man had pursued me literally for years while in South Africa. I come from South Africa originally. He would phone, "Hello, Vernon, this is PL. Are you studying Kabbalah?" And then he would send me letters. I never met him. I knew he was a student of some kind, maybe a year or two behind me. And
a mysterious stranger.
Maybe. And incidentally, when eventually we started finding major linkages with our model, our scientific model of thousands of hours at that time, the so-called TDVP, or triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm.
This is really the theory that's embodied in your book, Reality Begins with Consciousness.
Yeah, except I wouldn't use it as theory. It is the model, the metaparadigm that really reflects what some are calling, and I don't like the term, a theory of everything. But when we discovered this, I thought I better contact PL and say, "Look, I never understood why you kept pursuing me. Now I understand." The only problem was PL, after 2 years of research, we cannot locate him.
The person who has been after you 20 or 30 times to encourage you to study Kabbalah has vanished.
30 years ago, and now suddenly has vanished. He's not on the list of any names at the University of the Witwatersrand where he was supposed to be a student. And there are numerous others that I cannot, in terms of locate in terms of his name, for example, LinkedIn or any professional group. So it's just interesting. So that's the one component. But it doesn't introduce why I started looking at this.
What you seem to be suggesting is that the model that you've come up with, TDDVP, is consistent with your knowledge of Kabbalah, much to your surprise.
Yeah, and this began after we wrote our first draft of Reality Begins with Consciousness. So that was Reality Begins with Consciousness, first draft, first edition. It's gone to 5 editions. The latest was 2014. And we've spread out and written all sorts of other things since then.
Yes.
But it is to me anyway, a wonderful 500-page introduction at brainvoyage.com if you're interested.
Yes.
However, I'm in Hawaii and I'm talking to, in fact, a rabbi who I'm telling him about this book I've written. And he turns out to be a Kabbalist. And I tell him about space, time, and consciousness all being tethered together, all being closely knit and in union, tethered together, but separate substrates, as opposed to a lot of the mystical Indian philosophies where, for example, science, in terms of space and time, are contained, are expressions of the consciousness which doesn't really exist in the idealistic sense, or alternatively where consciousness simply is some kind of derivative of space and time. And he looks at me and he says, Shana, which means year, which reflects time. Nefesh, which sometimes is translated as soul, but we could translate that as consciousness. And Olam, which sometimes is translated as world, but we could translate this as space. He says that's pure Kabbalah. So, well, no, our model is quite different. It's far more complex than that. And it's a scientific model. Yes, but that's pure Kabbalah. And so I go home and I start looking at this and spend a day or two really trying to understand this. Well, it's just a coincidence.
I mean, you're already knowledgeable in the Hebrew language.
Yeah. A language I can speak relatively fluently. And I look at this and I say to myself, wait a minute. We've spent, at that point, between Dr. Edward Close and myself, maybe 4,000 hours looking at a model which we've called the Triadic Dimensional Distinction Vortical Paradigm, or TDDVP, or you can just make it 1D if you want. 4,000 hours, and it's all in Kabbalah, supposedly. Well, I wanted to, in a way, disintegrate. What's this purpose? And I said, hold on. If you are dealing with a mystical philosophy that has gone on, according to some sources, since the time of Abraham, so we're talking millennia, and it has persisted, the feasibility is that maybe there is something in it. There is something innately meaningful there.
I mean, the principle behind Kabbalah, as you're describing it, is that the Hebrew language itself, which is a very ancient language, has what might be called a sacred dimension to it, and embodied in the very letters and in the meaning, letter by letter by letter, are concepts.
Yes. One could use the phrase Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language.
Yes.
And it has been described as the holy language. And so I started saying to myself, well, what areas might be similar if one analyzed this in detail with Kabbalah, and how might this be different? Well, the first thing I learned is that Kabbalah is extremely ambiguous in a way, that there, at times, one author wrote, do you know there are 1,000 books a year now written about Kabbalah? And then he basically said probably 997 of them are absolute junk and, have people's own interpretations. And of course, the Kabbalah then extended from something Judaic to a whole form of Christian Kabbalah. And then there's even the Madonna kind of Kabbalah.
Yes.
And
well, one of my understandings regarding Kabbalah is that a certain strain of it is actually derived from Pythagoras. And now you, with your emphasis on mathematics in your theory, I would call you in some ways a Pythagorean or a Platonist, one who believes that the mathematical realities underlie the physical universe.
Very much so. We actually argue that mathematics is as fundamental in terms of existence as existence itself. That mathematics is not just some kind of way to get there, at some kind of calculation that most people don't understand and absolutely disintegrate when you use that term mathematics. It is something far greater. We think that proof in mathematics is fundamental to our reality, and that mathematics itself, in that Pythagorean sense, maybe in that Platonic sense, is something extremely important. And of course, that is one linkage with Kabbalic mysticism, which has its own mathematics. Some would not say this is Kabbalah at all, which has its gematria, where you can total up things and find all sorts of interesting pieces of information, still very much disputed whether or not that is real or not real, and control groups with Moby Dick in different languages. Doesn't matter. The point about it is certainly there are some mathematical elements, but there are some components of Kabbalah that certainly link up. And possibly I could just talk about a few of those.
Yes, indeed.
Well, fundamental to this idea of the triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm, big word or big phrase, well, let's use it TDVP in future, with the DD being 1D, but that's okay. Now, fundamental to that are three components. Component number one is consciousness. And certainly consciousness in Kabbalah might be reflecting a description of a divinity, of a deity.
Yes.
Fundamental to the second component is dimensions. And in triadic dimensional distinction, vortical paradigm, we've described 9 finite dimensions, not 10, not 15, not 26, not 8, not any other number, but 9 at that lowest level. It might be a multiple of 9 as well. It might be 81. It might be 729. Doesn't matter. The point about it is we are dealing with multiple dimensions. And most theories of everything break down just with the components pertaining to consciousness and dimensions. Kabbalah, it's interesting. They are a group of what some would call dimensions, but I'm not sure if it fits our definition of dimensions, which are measurable. And it might be measurable over space, time, and consciousness. And they're the so-called 10 sphirot, of which you are really dealing with 9 different qualities of humanity. So, for example, you have what would be called the Chabad components: Chokhmah, which is wisdom; Binah, which is understanding; Da'at, which Binah, which is knowledge; Da'at, which is well, it's also knowledge, but the Binah is the understanding component of it.
You're talking now about what is commonly known as the tree of life in Kabbalah.
We're talking about that tree of life and this Sephirot in relation to that.
The Sephirot are sometimes thought of as 10 different emanations of God.
Exactly that, at that lower level. And in fact, if you want, 9 different emanations, all dynamically rotating as we have with TDVP and interfacing with each other. It's just a question of, are these emanations dimensional or are they not? And then you get to a 10th level. And variably one might talk about something like Malchut, which would be a kingdom or a component in terms of royalty, it doesn't really matter again. But the point about it is that translates to our TDVP to the so-called trans-finite reality. In other words, we're dealing with 9 finite quantized dimensions, and the next quantized extension forever is the transfinite, something we'll talk about more when we discuss infinity. But bear in mind that these are all discrete little bits of information as opposed to an infinite continuity.
So what you seem to be suggesting is, as your TDVP paradigm is in some ways a map of higher dimensions, you find that that map is what I might call isomorphic to the Sephirot of Kabbalah.
Yes, that is true. And that is, to me, rather interesting in this regard, particularly as you will understand the dynamism within those Sephirot and those different components, and also the emanations supposedly from God or divinity in terms of Kabbalic wisdom. And that introduces the idea of infinity. And the Hebrew for infinity is Ein Sof, without an end. To me, when we wrote the book, Reality Begins with Consciousness, we realized that if you're dealing with infinity as a without an end, you're also dealing with Ein Tchila, which means without a beginning. And suddenly there is this whole circular component of what came first, the world or what, and you've got to differentiate the finite from the infinite reality. So these are 3 fundamental components of TDVP: dimensions, infinity, and consciousness. And so I looked at, in Reality Begins with Consciousness, we had 24 different models of theories of everything, and excluding those of Dr. Edward Close and Dr. Vernon Neppe and our composite, which incidentally at that point scored a perfect 39 out of 39. And I've just re-looked at this, not analyzed all the different models, but we're now at something like 62 out of 62.
And I might mention what we're talking about here are criterion for what a theory of everything needs to have that you've developed. You and I have done a prior interview just on that.
On exactly that.
The criteria for theories of everything.
Right. So now when you start looking at these, just dimensions, infinity, consciousness, guess how many models fit dimensions, infinity, consciousness? You're virtually excluding the whole lot. Many of them have ideas pertaining to consciousness, which is interesting because the standard model of physics, which incidentally scores, I think, 13 out of 39, does not have. So that's our baseline, if you want, but they're not too many at all, besides the close Neppe components. The Kabbalah component, if you accept that this tree of life is dimensional in basis.
Which is what is always spoken of about it.
And strangely enough, a colleague of yours whom you know well, whose overall score did not score so well, but Saul Paul Sirag's model also fits this whole component in terms of those 3 elements. So that's the initial component.
And I also know from his work, at least early on, that he was able to map his own theories onto the tree of life very precisely, not only the 10 Sephirot, but I believe there are 22 pathways between the different Sephirot that seem to map onto his theory.
There's a multitude of pathways, and in fact, there are different levels that go above those Sephirot, and like there are 5 different levels, and then when you start looking at it, there are 125 steps, which I don't then describe, but of course 125 is just 5 cubed. So each one, the one goes within the other, which goes within the other, which goes within the other. So we've already got those different components.
So what we're talking about is a very precise and detailed map of higher dimensions of you could say higher dimensions of space or higher dimensions of consciousness that are mapped out both in your theory and in the Kabbalistic tree of life.
Yes, that is true. Now, when you extend this, the next fundamental component of our model, triadic dimensional distinction vortical paradigm of TDVP, is the fact that we are dealing with the laws of nature. We're not dealing with something that is supernatural. We're not dealing with, this is a miracle. It happened and it shouldn't have happened. It is a miracle. It is beyond our laws of nature. It must be God. So this is where TDVP fits in. Mm-hmm. And because of the ambiguity that I've found within Kabbalah, certainly you're going to find many who are going to say, oh, I'm really upset with him. I was listening to him now, but now he's talking about the fact that there's no miracles and there's nothing supernatural. And I am, I suppose, talking about it. But I'm talking about the laws of nature, and I'm talking about the laws of nature, and if you want to, some of the Kabbalic thinking is that those laws of nature are the deity itself.
Yes.
And it is impacting and influencing us, and we're impacting and influencing there. And there is a lot of data in relation to prayer in this regard, and the influence of prayer. So it's a bidirectional phenomenon, and you know that within TDVP, we have our component where we've talked about dimensions, which are really, if you want the framework, the extent. We've talked about content, which contains the mass, energy, and gimel, which we think, under certain circumstances, is a consciousness, and that these are all in union together.
Now, I gather there's no place in the TDVP model for prayer.
Yes, there is.
Oh, well, let's hear about that.
Of course there's a place.
Yes.
This is what we're talking about in terms of influence and impact.
Okay.
The difference here is, you will remember, there was, well, this is all Kabbalah, year and world and soul translated into time and space and consciousness and this linkage there. But that soul linkage is also perceived as a linkage with God.
In Kabbalah.
In Kabbalah.
Yes.
And here is the prayer there. And in our model, we have extent, measurable, content. Yes. There has to be a container. There has to be things there. This is why I said there's no emptiness, which Einstein described as well.
Yes.
But I'm mentioning it because one keeps on talking about empty space.
Yes.
But this is simplistic. Yeah. It's empty space because there's Gimel there.
Empty space is very dynamic.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the third component is, we used to call it intent. Now we call it influence and impact. And this is the third element. But it's not only a prayer element where one might be praying to a deity. And this is incidentally right across to all religions. It's not just a Judaic Kabbalah or any other Kabbalah. There is also other kinds of impacts. You have a major earthquake. That involves a lot of movement of space, a lot of mass energy. So the impact is there as well. And so maybe here there is a difference, because the philosophy might be, and there are some great philosophers in sort of the rabbinical tradition who would talk about this. As far as I remember, the Baal Shem Tov was a panentheist in terms of God is in everything, God is part of everything. But that would introduce just one component of the philosophical side of TDVP, because what about the impact and the influence of the physical phenomena of an atomic bomb? What about the impact and influence of us just talking to each other. This is also very, very different. But in relation to your question about prayer, most certainly it is right there. And then we have these triads, and you'll remember we've spoken about the space-time consciousness triad. We talked about tethering.
Yes.
You could say it's like a boat is moored to the dock, except it's more than that, because you cannot separate out it. It's not a case of saying space and time we cannot separate out. It's space, time, and consciousness. But it introduces a question. And this is what, in a way, I learned from my Kabbalic thinking, because I would eventually say, wait a minute, what does Kabbalah say about this? And I would be able to extend my model. Now,
Vernon, you mentioned to me earlier that you went through a phase of torment when you realized that the Kabbalah seemed to be so accurately mapping your own theory.
Yeah, imagine. You spend thousands of hours, you develop a major scientific model, you develop a scientific model that is, so to say, a theory of everything, but doesn't cover necessarily everything, but everything it covers fits. And that's why we use the word metaparadigm, scientific model, and suddenly the philosophical side, we discover, is very, very much linked with Kabbalic mysticism. Of course, this was tormenting until I realized that this probably means that it's fundamental. And whenever we've gone further in terms of our exploration, we're discovering that our hypotheses match, that they are correct. And this is not surprising.
Now, one of my understandings regarding Kabbalah and prayer, and maybe it's unique to me, but I think the idea is that the prayer ideally rises up through various dimensions to the various emanations or levels of God or the deity to get all the way up to the highest deity. And that requires an elevation of consciousness. That's in many ways, the purpose of the Tree of Life is a map of the way in which the consciousness can rise up to the highest throne of the highest heaven.
Yes, and this might be so. And this might be a reasoning why, when we are living here in our physical reality, we broadly talk about consciousness in the most basic of ways. We realize that consciousness is in some kind of way linked up with the brain, and there are all sorts of neurons in relation to this, and nerve cells and connections and synapses. And if we extend it a little further, we might say there's a psychological consciousness. And some would say, well, that psychological consciousness is all conditioned by different neurons anyway, and it's not even there. And that's where we stop. And we don't get anyway elevated, because if you look at the 9-dimensional model, and you look at a model of something that is dynamic, that is spinning, that is moving upwards more and more, by the time you get to consciousness, you're way beyond little restricted 3 dimensions of space. It's restricted, incidentally, because we can't pick up X-rays or ultraviolet light or infrared. So it's restricted 3S1T, the 1T being the present. You go up and up, you elevate, and the next level you get to is probably time. And we cannot prove it, but mathematically 3-dimensional time certainly fits this model. And then 3 dimensions of consciousness. The space is embedded in time, and the time is embedded in the consciousness. And the consciousness is much, much higher. And this is where the whole component of, when I was young, when I started learning things in psychology and in psychiatry, I used to think that the best level, the level you'd want to attain, is self-actualization, actualizing oneself inside the brain. And then I realized that wow, I was missing most of consciousness.
And you were a neuroscientist.
Yeah. Here's this neuroscientist saying, yes, there's a brain, and you can get all sorts of good concepts from this brain. But if you extend beyond the brain and you allow yourself to link up with extended consciousness, either individual consciousness focusing in, boom, coming in as meaning in a way and translating into the brain, or if you allowed yourself just to be far, far broader, there would be a consciousness that would be, so to say, quantized, in quanta, in little bits, discrete, in those 9 dimensions and into the transfinite. And there would also be an extended consciousness that was infinite, that was an infinite continuity. And this is the whole point. You get higher and higher and higher. And you might say, well, it's TDVP. Where do the vortices come in? This is where the vortices come in. The rotations that extend further and further, like the ballerina or like the tornado. And initially I thought, well, wait a minute, Kabbalah does not have vortices. But Kabbalah does have vortices. I had to find this in the work of Label Wolf. So it's very interesting. We're dealing with a metaparadigm at every kind of level, at the level of the laws of nature, maybe, because in some ways, we regard things as miracles because they've just gone beyond 3S1T and we cannot understand it, and supernatural. But maybe God is those laws of nature. We're dealing with an infinity. We're dealing with triads and tethering. We're dealing with a whole model of reality. We're dealing with something very important here, what I call ordropy. And that ordropy is at the infinite level of order. And so it's the opposite of entropy at that physical level, everything tending towards disorder. There's some multidimensional order. And then we have our dimensions.
Entropy.
Yeah, entropy.
Okay.
Then we have our dimensions, and we have our unification. And for me, we have a philosophical model that we've also discussed called unified monism, which incorporates that panentheism that I spoke about.
Yeah.
And so you go through this whole thing, and suddenly you have your consciousness, and you have these different link-ups. Just one further comment, and that is, I recently had a physicist from India who wrote to me and said, I've just been reading your book, and I'm reading it again, and I'm studying it, and I'm developing this component. And he told me about Jainism.
Oh, yes.
And this is also very much linked there, except as I'm understanding it, it's a trans-deism, as opposed to a single monotheism. And just to differentiate out all of these things, people don't use terms like theism and deism enough. Theism implies there is a God that is impacting upon our reality. Deism implies, yeah, there's a God and he might be a creator and he might have done everything, but he doesn't have any interest in this. In other words, he is not impacting and influencing. You asked about prayer.
Well,
those are the
deists deal with what we might call the God of the philosophers. The theists deal with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah. So this gives a little bit of a perspective of Kabbalah, spirituality, and science. But the important component here is you will remember that there are those thinkers who say there is the magisterium of science and the magisterium of spirituality, of religion, and the two cannot meet. And here I'm busy saying this is the meeting point. The meeting point is if you go beyond these different levels from 3S1T and you go higher and higher in terms of elevations, you find the commonalities of infinity, of dimensions, of consciousness, of laws of nature, of link-ups in terms of the triadic tethering, and all of these beautifully fit in.
Dr. Vernon Neppe, once again, a very elegant discourse. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.